Rising fuel prices always stir up sentiment among South Africans, and of course we had a rise of close to 50 cents a litre for petrol earlier this month. Could more price hikes be looming though? The National Energy Regulator recently granted Transnet Pipelines a 12% revenue rise for the next financial year. This was much lower though than the 51.3% increase Transnet had applied for. Transnet says it can't comment on the increase until it knows more about the rationale for it. In the meantime though, I'm joined by Dr Rod Crompton. He's Nersa's member responsible for Petroleum Pipelines Regulation, as well as Abapfani Tshifularo. He's Executive Director at the South African Petroleum Industry Association. Good afternoon, gents. Thanks both very much for coming in this afternoon. Rod, investments in new pipeline infrastructure, obviously important, and that's why Transnet has asked for such a steep increase. What were the reasons why you didn't give the increase that Transnet applied for?
There are several reasons. We have a well-established methodology that we've used, consulted with stakeholders very thoroughly on, and we apply that methodology, and in different years there are different reasons depending on the factors. One of the contributing factors this year was a clawback from revenue allowed in the previous year, and that was to do with pipelines that were supposed to have been built and brought into operation and that weren't. So if I can give you an example of the consequences of this for motorists, last year they were admitted at 1 billion, cost of 1 billion. This year, because of the delay and other factors, they now admitted at 2 billion. So that's an extra R1 billion that motorists are going to have to pay over the course of the life of these pipelines. So that's an example of some of the things that change in the course of these project developments.
And of course, when you do grant a tariff increase, it's only for projects that are going to come on stream further down the line. It's not for existing projects, is it?
That's right. We don't allow people to get paid for things they haven't started doing yet. They'll only get revenue when those projects actually come into operation.
But funny, how do increases such as these ones, the ones we're talking about, feed into the petrol price going forward, and what sort of impact on consumers?
Well, any price increase, either in tariff or taxes, it's reflected clearly in the price structure. So it has its, direct impact. You're going to see clearly if we follow the media release from the Department of Energy, they will clearly identify what is the pipeline tariff increase for that matter. And what is important is that, to highlight is that, the increase, as Dr. Crompton has mentioned, it was less of what has been applied for because of a clawback of certain costs. However, what we still need to bear in mind is that down the line or in the future, we'll still have to incur those costs. So we should anticipate paying higher tariff than what we're paying currently now.
And of course, Rod, we know from what's happening at Eskom what the dangers are of not investing in infrastructure timeously, and that's why we sit with many problems at Eskom. Do we run that risk at Transnet by not investing enough now for them to develop pipelines?
No, I don't think so. I think the investment is being made, and there are delays in bringing these projects into operation. That is a concern that Nersa has been concerned about. The escalation in the costs of these projects has also been something that we're concerned about.
And of course, I looked at the escalation in the costs for one of the new pipelines. It's the multi-purpose pipeline, and it has gone up quite dramatically over the past year, hasn't it?
It has indeed.
Do you think that consumers should be paying for infrastructure at Transnet that's going to be developed, or should it be taken from the debt markets?
Well, for us, what is important is that we know there's a need to expand the existing pipeline capacity. And either way, whether the money is, coming from the shareholder, which is government in this case, or whether it goes, to be raised from the capital markets, or whether the motorists, are asked to pay indirectly via the tariff. It's the major challenge is how does the regulator recognize all these different types of sources that are used for funding. And at the end of the day, somebody has to pay. As the majority users of the pipeline are SAPIA members, we know the need for the pipeline. We need this new pipeline to come up on stream. Actually, we would have preferred to get it even much earlier. But at the end of the day, somebody has to pay for...
Rod, how do you recognise the different sources of funding that Transnet can use for paying for infrastructure? Of course, Abapfani talked about the capital markets, talked about major shareholder, the government, and obviously the consumer. How do you mix those together to actually give that tariff at the end of the day?
I think the real issue is the nature of the project which is being undertaken. For both Eskom and Transnet, both companies are trying to approximately quadruple their asset base, and in Transnet's case, without any contribution from the shareholder up till now. So even with a contribution from the shareholder, for any normal company to quadruple its asset base is an extraordinary challenge, and both Eskom and Transnet have that challenge. It's the funding structure which is really important, and how we as a country and as a government deal with that funding structure. There are different regulatory dispensations for electricity and petroleum pipelines, so they're not strictly comparable, and you can see that reflected in the different kinds of decisions.
And how are we funding it? I mean, what's your view on the mix of funding to date?
At the moment, Transnet is very, very lowly geared, so much so that our tariff methodology requires a minimum of 30% equity. And we have invoked that. They are in fact below 30% equity at this time. But next year, that will probably all swing around to almost the opposite extreme when a large chunk of this new multi-products pipeline project comes into the asset base.
Of course, you talked about, sorry?
So we recognize both debt and equity. And debt we cost at their cost of debt, and equity is where we have some differences of opinion with Transnet on as to how exactly, what should the cost of equity be. And that's a very big academic debate amongst regulators and between regulators and regulated entities all over the world.
I'm sure one that could go on forever as well. You talked about the clawback you did for the previous financial year due to some of the delays in the projects. Have those projects come online? Are the delays narrowing?
No, the projects that were allowed last year didn't come online, and that's why we had to claw it back this year. We have admitted them again this year, and they're scheduled to come online in June, and we're talking about 3 of the smaller, shorter pipelines as part of this whole NMPP project. The big pipeline is now scheduled to come on 2011 or later, possibly 2012, and we're watching with great keen interest, because it does affect the issue that Abapfani is very concerned about, which is security of supply.
Well, that was something I wanted to ask you, Abapfani, about security of supply, particularly with the Soccer World Cup just around the corner. We know there's going to be a lot more demand for petrol, for diesel, for jet fuel. Are we going to have it where it's supposed to be in time?
Well, the most important thing to recognize is that with regards to World Cup, we can't change anything with regards to infrastructure. We have to maximize the use of the available infrastructure. We know the pipeline has been full for a number of years now, which is our first preference. And it's followed by the rail tankers, which are all Transnet-owned companies. And for World Cup, really, we have been in discussion with various stakeholders, the logistics owners, the oil companies, the government, the airlines. And we are confident that with the plans that we have in place, we will be able to supply fuel during the World Cup and even post.
Abapfani, will all garages be accepting credit cards during the World Cup? Because obviously foreigners are going to be coming here. Many of them used to paying for petrol with credit cards. Will our garages accept those credit cards?
It is not mandatory for all garages to accept credit cards. It's really up to individual dealers to take such a decision. Like you will see, you go to other retailers, they don't accept certain credit cards. They do accept credit cards, sometimes they don't at all. So I know for a fact not all retail service stations are accepting credit cards.
But they are now allowed to accept credit cards.
They are allowed. The regulation do allow that.
And Dr. Crompton, you plan to continue investigations and consultations on the tariff increases going forward from here. It's obviously not going to affect this year's increases. Do you think it could have a change on how you view those tariff requests going forward from here?
The investigation we're looking into is the structure of the tariffs, and by that we mean not the allowable revenue which is allowed to Transnet Pipelines, but the cost or the tariff for each particular pipeline from A to B or C to D and so on and so forth. And we've been concerned that there hasn't been a systematic underpinning rationale for those, and we would like to have that so that they are defensible by us and by anyone else. There's a lot of complex issues, and that was reflected in the public hearing we had, where we had senior counsel representing various oil companies and Transnet with fundamentally different understandings of the same piece of legislation. And fundamentally different facts on what the nature of the network is and so forth. So that's the investigation we'll be conducting.